Final Fantasy Fables, Chocobo Tales. This is a cute storybook Chocobo adventure game that came out pretty early in the Nintendo DS's lifespan. And because of that, it definitely feels like a game that is trying very hard to work with the Nintendo DS system. And what you essentially get here is a adventure game that is peppered full of various mini games built around the touchscreen on the Nintendo DS. Now, there is like a combat system in here as well, but unfortunately, it's not something that you get to use that much. We'll get in a bit more detail as we go into this little review here. So if you don't know what, Final Fantasy Fables is, essentially it's the Chocobo-centric franchise that features Chocobo as the main character, essentially. And I believe the original series was the Mystery Dungeon games. I don't know for sure, but that is kind of the core of this series. And this title, while very different from those Mystery Dungeon games, shares a lot of the same characters and things like that. And one of the key things about this game is that it's all based around like storybooks. And these storybooks are kind of melded into the presentation as well. You get these like fairy tales that you read throughout the game, and you get these little pop-out book cutscenes and things like that. And they take stories like Little Red Riding Hood and Jack and the Beanstalk, and they turn them into Final Fantasy tales, working in various Final Fantasy characters or Final Fantasy enemy races and things like that. Mostly I would say like enemy races over like actual characters. Like you're not seeing Cloud in this game, right? It's like Cactars, Adamantoises, Bahamutes, Leviathan, Summons, Shiva, Ifrit, things like that, right? But these stories are all connected to the mini games that are spread throughout the world. When you open these books, not only do you get the storybook story, but you play these mini games, and you have to basically get a high score in those mini games to unlock the ending for each of these stories. And there's actually multiple endings for most of the book. So the higher score you get, or the more times you play through a mini game, the more and more endings you kind of unlock. Now, I will say, in terms of like unlocking these endings and things like that, I kind of personally didn't love the gameplay of a lot of these mini games. Like I said, they're very much built around the Nintendo DS touchscreens, and being an early DS game, you can definitely see them just kind of experimenting with what it means to use a touchscreen to control a game like this. And I would say most of them fall anywhere between like inoffensive and unremarkable, right? Like there's nothing wrong with playing them, but they just kind of come off as nothing experiences for the most part. Just like, okay, well, indeed I did do that. But unfortunately, despite them being kind of like, I would say, the weakest part of this game, you will be forced to replay them multiple times. For story progression, sometimes you need to unlock certain endings in a book. So it'd be like, there's a river we need to fill up or something, so you have to play the Leviathan book until you get the ending that has it, like, ending with him, like, causing it to rain or something like that. And then so that fills up the river in the real world kind of thing. Progressing through that story basically will help you unlock different parts of the world, as well as get access to different dungeons so you can, go through the main plot. The story-wise, there's not much going on here, especially like in the world itself. This is a very small world, mostly just kind of there to facilitate a overworld for you to go between these books, essentially. But occasionally there are some cute little fun little gimmicks and mazes and things like that throughout the world. But it's more of an excuse to, have a story, connect all these mini games together. And all these like characters and stuff in this world are, kind of inconsequential in a lot of ways. But there's a lot of cute, silly, fun, like dialogue, a lot of rhymes and things like that. It all fits very well with the storybook aesthetic of the rest of the game. And honestly, I think it fits really well with the general like DS aesthetics as a whole, where you have a lot of like chibi characters and things like that. But these story sequences you go through eventually will lead into RPG battles, but it's very different than like a traditional Final Fantasy. It's actually a card-based system here where you build a deck, and then so each turn you're dealt out, 3 cards. Although, when you use one card, then another card comes to your hand out, like three new cards every turn. And so these cards that you build your deck with actually come from the various minigames you play. So if you do play the minigames, you're rewarded in more ways than just story. You're also rewarded with these cards that feed into this battle system, essentially. So you only have 3 cards in your hand at a time, so it's pretty simple in like what you can actually do a lot of the times. And each of these cards basically have 4 different elements, and those elements are represented by the color of the card itself. But the dots on the side of the card represent, what an element will attack against and what element it will defend against and things like that. So you can go ahead and use that to basically kind of like counter your opponent's cards. So if you see an enemy has like all water cards in their hand, because you have like this little preview window where you can see what elements cards they have, you want to put out a card that has like a water defense on it, and then you also kind of want to consider what that card can do for you otherwise. But ultimately, if a card defends an element, it will go ahead and block all that damage. And because each turn is timed, you do have to kind of like make very quick decisions on a lot of these things. But there's a lot of additional effects on the cards, beyond just the elemental attacks. There's, status ailments, there's various buffs and things like that as well. And then more importantly probably is that each of these cards can also have a special move that's connected to something that's called crystal points, or like a crystal energy kind of thing. And these crystal point abilities are basically abilities that will only trigger if you have a certain number of crystals in your inventory. And this inventory, or maybe not inventory, but like you have like a crystal bar essentially. So every time you act with a card in this game, that an element of that crystal to show up in that bar. So if you use 3 fire cards in a row, you'll have 3 fire crystals. If you use a water card and 2 light cards in a row, you'll have a water and 2 light crystals basically. And so what happens is you build up these energies, and while you don't expend them really, like if you use a crystal point that requires a red crystal, it doesn't like get rid of that crystal. It just requires that you have these crystals in your hand essentially. And so you can use these to kind of do various effects in the game, and more importantly, deal more damage. Some of these are a lot simpler though, where it's just like, hey, you'll just do extra 4 damage, or hey, you'll slow the enemy and things like that. But other ones actually will make it so you can really abuse the crystals in your hand. So if you have a card that says does 2 damage for every red crystal in your hand, if you have 5 red crystals in your hand, you're gonna do a ton of damage. Most bosses in this game have like 20 HP. So it's very, very easy to like one-shot an enemy, assuming they don't block it, right? The blocks are a definitive block in this game. So it is very, very likely you'll set up a really devastating move only to have it blocked when you use it, kind of thing. But there's also cards that will use the crystals of your opponents as well. So if your opponent has all red crystals and you have a card that says, do 2 damage for every red crystal in their inventory, then it will go ahead and blow you up too. So it's very easy to have, these very extensive sways in the balance of battle during combat, which I think is kind of a fun thing for this game. It is, some of the battles can go on a little long because of that, I feel like, because there's these kind of like all-out defenses moves that you can do where you can block these big attacks, but it also is like really satisfying when it feels like you kind of outplayed your opponent. But with only 3 cards in your inventory, there's kind of not a lot you can do at the same time, so you kind of let it go if it seems like you didn't play right. A lot of times it just depends on what cards end up in your hand. It's kind of the nature of card games in general, and the less cards you have act to you at once, the more and more random combat can feel at times. So there's definitely times it feels like you lose simply because you drew the wrong cards over everything else. But all of this is like really wrapped up in a really cool aesthetic. The monsters in the game have share that storybook aesthetic. They're all made out of like 2D sprites basically, and they all kind of like different parts of them that move around and things like that. So they look like they're all made out of paper in a very Paper Mario kind of fashion. And along with like the great Final Fantasy remixes going on in the background, and a lot of like fun cinematic camera angles during battle, it's a very flashy experience overall. Though I will say, at times it does feel like the combat system moves a little too slow. It's like an animation that shows you like whether an attack is successful or not, and then it does the attack, where it feels like you could just like cut out one part of that animation and just have the attack happen and show if the attack was blocked or defended, without going out of your way to play an additional animation to show like the results of your cards clashing at the same time. Now, unfortunately, despite as much as this combat system is pretty cool, and I would say probably one of the strongest parts of this game, they are very, very rare. Clearly, the minigames are the focus here, and so you can probably count the number of fights you do in this game on 2 hands. It's very, very simple, very, very minimal part of the game. But though if you want to, you can go back and like reduel enemies and things like that. I never really did that. And then previously this actually had an online mode, and it might still function today if you connect to like the Nintendo Wi-Fi fan servers that are out there. I don't know. I didn't test it myself to see if it actually works or anything like that. But there's a possibility you could do duels, but I'm going to take a strong guess that there's not a lot of people out there looking for duels on those servers, so you have to probably organize organize your own Final Fantasy Chocobo Tales tournament if you're really interested. But yeah, I just wish this game had a bigger focus on this part of the game. But it's not necessarily, a bad thing. This is a very cool game overall, and I can definitely understand, given the early DS era that this came out, why they would focus on the mini games. But, while the mini games are monotonous, I think the storybook renditions that come with them and kind of inform their design are really cool looking, and they're kind of cute, fun little stories here as well, with like various like rhyming in it and stuff like that too. But it all fits in overall very well and contributes to a very fun, charming aesthetic and story too. And I'm glad the battle system, while not the focus here, I'm glad it was in the game, because I think that really helps make the gameplay of this title feel a bit more substantial than if it was just the mini games themselves. And it is like less than 10 hours, so even if you don't find it the most engaging experience overall, if you just want to see kind of the story, the world, and the characters and things like that, it's a very short game, so you'll be able to get through it without having to do a ton of like grinding or anything like that.